for further talks on where there might be some room.
It's not for sale, won't be for sale.
After a very tumultuous.
But when I looked at that butte, I said,
several American cities, United States President Donald Trump has chosen a striking response. Rather than offering assistance, he has publicly assigned blame. In a post on his Truth Social platform, he held Canada responsible for the smoke reaching the United States, described the incoming air in unusually harsh terms, and suggested that the costs tied to these fires should be added to the tariffs Canada already faces. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Ontario Premier Doug Ford have answered in very different ways, and the contrast between blame and cooperation now sits at the heart of this developing story. Let me lay out exactly what happened, because the details matter here. According to his own statement, the American president wrote that the United States is holding Canada responsible for what he called a failure to properly maintain its forests and the vegetation within them. He argued that the United States was being affected by polluted and unhealthy air crossing the border, and he called the situation dangerous and unacceptable. He then indicated that he intended to raise the matter directly with Prime Minister Carney by telephone. The most consequential part of the message came at the end, where he tied the wildfire smoke to trade policy in a way that few observers expected. The president claimed that the wildfires are costing the United States a significant amount of money, and he suggested that this cost should be attached to the tariffs Canada is currently paying. In plain terms, that would mean treating cross-border smoke from a natural disaster as something that could be folded into an ongoing trade dispute. It is important to be precise about this point. This was a suggestion, a proposal placed into a social media statement, not a formal policy that has been enacted. No mechanism has been announced for how such a cost would be calculated, applied, or enforced, and officials have not detailed any concrete step beyond the president's own words. The timing is what makes this especially notable. This is not a disagreement about steel, automobiles, or dairy, the kinds of subjects that have defined recent trade tensions between the two countries. This time, the underlying issue is a natural disaster that is affecting communities on both sides of the border. Smoke from Canadian wildfires has moved into the northern United States, and air quality readings in several American cities have deteriorated sharply. That is the backdrop against which these comments arrived, and it is a large part of why they generated such a strong reaction across Canada. Consider the situation on the ground for a moment. Reports this week indicated that smoke tied to Ontario wildfires helped push Detroit to among the worst air quality readings recorded anywhere in the world on that day. Earlier in the week, Toronto had experienced similar conditions, with a heavy haze settling over the city. These are not abstract numbers. Hazardous air quality warnings affect ordinary people, including children, older adults, and anyone with respiratory conditions. That reality is precisely why many Canadians expected expressions of concern or offers of support, and why the accusatory tone of the president's message landed the way it did. There is also a human cost to this wildfire season that deserves to be acknowledged clearly. Earlier this month, a firefighting pilot from British Columbia lost his life in a crash while helping to battle wildfires in the American state of Colorado. That single fact reframes much of the debate. It is a reminder that Canadian personnel have been assisting the United States even beyond Canada's own borders, and that the cooperation between these two countries in fighting fires has at times come at the highest possible price. Many Canadians pointed to that loss as evidence that the relationship has never been one-sided. Now let me turn to the wider political context, because the president's post did not appear in isolation. It followed public comments from Republican Congressman John James, who is currently running to become governor of the state of Michigan and who carries an endorsement from the president. In a message on the social platform X, the congressman issued what he described as a final warning to Canada, urging better forest management to prevent these fires, and arguing that Americans were suffering the consequences of what he characterized as Canadian inaction. That framing, that the fires stem primarily from poor forest management, quickly became a central point of contention. This is where I want to add some careful context, because the claim about forest management touches on a genuine scientific debate. The argument that wildfires can be prevented mainly through better forest maintenance is one that critics of certain climate policies have often advanced. Fire experts, however, point to broader conditions, including drought and unusually dry weather driven by rising temperatures, as major factors in the severity of recent wildfire seasons. It is also worth noting the sheer scale involved. Canada's boreal forests stretch across roughly 552 million hectares, much of it remote, uninhabited, and far from any community, which makes the idea of preventing fires through routine maintenance alone extremely difficult. There is another detail that complicates the blame directed northward. The United States has been dealing with its own significant wildfire activity. Figures cited in coverage of this dispute indicate that fires within the United States had already consumed around 1.4 million hectares of American territory this summer.
Today, a meeting between two neighbors, their historic alliance in tatters.
Thank you for your hospitality.
That number matters because it undercuts the notion that wildfire smoke is a problem imported entirely from Canada. Fire and the smoke it produces do not respect national boundaries, and both countries have been contending with the effects of a difficult season at the same time. That brings us to the responses from Canadian leaders, which is really where this story turns. One of the most direct reactions came from Ontario Premier Doug Ford. He reminded Americans that when the United States has faced severe wildfires in places such as California, Canada has repeatedly sent aircraft, personnel, and resources to help. His central point was straightforward. When a neighbor is struggling, you offer support rather than criticism. He suggested that politicians voicing complaints would do better to send assistance, framing that kind of mutual aid as simply what good neighbors are supposed to do for one another. Ford's message resonated, in part, because it was grounded in a documented pattern of cooperation. Canadian water bombers and crews have crossed into the United States during past emergencies, and that history was on the minds of many Canadians reacting online. The Premier's tone was firm, but not hostile toward Americans in general. He drew a distinction between the American public, whom he described as good neighbors, and specific politicians whose comments he found unhelpful. That distinction is worth noting, because it kept his response focused on the behavior at issue, rather than on the broader relationship between the two countries. Prime Minister Mark Carney took a noticeably different approach, and the contrast is instructive. Rather than escalating the exchange with personal attacks, he framed the wildfires as part of a larger, shared challenge. His central argument was that these fires are not solely Canada's burden to carry, but a global problem that calls for a coordinated response. He emphasized that climate change is a shared responsibility, and he suggested that countries facing increasingly severe fire seasons should be working together rather than trading accusations. In doing so, he tried to shift the conversation away from confrontation and toward cooperation. Carney also used the moment to draw a comparison between the two countries' policy directions. He pointed to Canada's continued investment in clean energy, and he contrasted that with restrictions in the United States, citing limits affecting sources such as wind energy as an example. He further argued that Canada was maintaining its climate efforts on the world stage, while the United States was, in his characterization, scaling back its own global commitments. These are his framings and his claims, offered from Canada's perspective, and they reflect a broader disagreement between the two governments about the causes of severe wildfire seasons and the best way to address them. The Prime Minister's response came in part as a reaction to more than just the president's post. Republican lawmakers had also sent a letter to Carney on the subject. That letter claimed that Canada's provincial leaders had offered excuses rather than results, and it stated that Michigan Republicans were, in their words, done accepting apologies in place of action. The letter echoed the argument that American lungs were paying the price for what its authors described as Canadian inaction. Carney's reply returned to his central theme, that responsibility for climate change is shared across borders and cannot be assigned to a single country. Let me pause here to separate what has actually been confirmed from what remains a proposal or a claim, because that distinction is easy to lose in a fast-moving story. What is confirmed is that wildfires are burning, that smoke has degraded air quality in cities on both sides of the border, and that the American president publicly blamed Canada and floated adding wildfire-related costs to tariffs. What is not confirmed is any formal policy to actually do so. The idea of a tariff tied to smoke remains, at this stage, a statement rather than an implemented measure, and its practical feasibility is far from clear. The economic dimension here is worth examining, even in its early and uncertain form. Tariffs are taxes applied to goods crossing a border, and they are typically justified by reference to trade in physical products. Attaching a cost to something like drifting smoke would be an unusual step, one without an obvious precedent, and it raises immediate questions about how such a charge could be measured or legally supported. For businesses and industries already navigating existing trade friction between the two countries, uncertainty of this kind is itself a concern, because unpredictability makes planning more difficult.
And I'm sure the American side too were using today to scope out what could be the foundation for further talks and where there might be some room for cooperation.
It is not yet clear whether this proposal will move beyond rhetoric. To understand why this matters so much, we need to consider the relationship at stake. Canada and the United States share the world's longest undefended border, and their partnership has long included mutual aid during emergencies. The two countries have assisted one another through floods, storms, and wildfires over many years. That cooperation is a foundation of the relationship, and it is precisely that foundation that many Canadians felt was being questioned this week. The frustration expressed across the country was not only about a single social media post, it was about the sense that a well-established norm of helping a neighbor in crisis had been set aside.
We're sitting in one right now, Buckingham Palace that you visited as well.
That's true.
Having met with the owners of Canada over the course of the campaign.
There is also a broader diplomatic issue embedded in all of this. When leaders respond to a natural disaster, their words carry weight beyond the immediate moment. A crisis can become an opportunity to strengthen ties, or it can become a source of new tension. In this case, Canadians watched two contrasting models unfold at the same time. On one side, statements from the American president and allied politicians emphasized blame and pressure. On the other, Canadian leaders emphasized cooperation and shared responsibility.
Time to resolve.
This is a bigger discussion. There are much bigger forces involved, and this will take some time and some discussions, and that's why we're here.
The gap between those approaches is the real story, and it is one that will likely shape the tone of cross-border relations in the weeks ahead. For ordinary people, the practical consequences may be more immediate than the political ones. Hazardous air quality affects daily life in concrete ways. Health authorities generally advise limiting time outdoors during heavy smoke, and warnings can disrupt work, school activities, and outdoor events. For residents of affected American states such as Michigan, and for Canadians in cities like Toronto that experienced heavy smoke earlier in the week, the health impact is the most tangible part of this story. That shared experience of poor air on both sides of the border is, in a sense, the strongest argument for the cooperative approach that Canadian leaders have urged. There is a legal and procedural question that also deserves attention. If the president were to pursue the idea of adding wildfire-related costs to tariffs, the path forward would not be simple. Trade measures typically involve established processes, and any attempt to link an environmental event to trade policy would likely face scrutiny over how it is justified. At this point, no such process has been announced, and officials have not explained how the concept would work in practice. That leaves the proposal in an uncertain space, where it exists as a stated intention without a defined mechanism behind it. I want to address the question many viewers are likely asking, which is whether any of this will actually change trade policy between the two countries. The honest answer is that it is too early to know. A statement on social media is not the same as a formal decision, and the president indicated only that he intended to raise the matter with Prime Minister Carney. Whether that conversation leads to any concrete action remains to be seen. One possible outcome is that the exchange remains largely rhetorical.
No,
Why not?
just the way it is.
Carney, who is a two-time central bank chief himself, went on to agree. Economic differences will take time.
Another is that it becomes one more point of friction in an already tense trade relationship. Both remain possible. The political response adds another layer to consider. In the United States, comments tying Canadian wildfires to forest management have become a talking point among some officials, particularly in states affected by the smoke. In Canada, the reaction is cut across party lines to a notable degree, with figures who often differ politically expressing a shared frustration. That kind of cross-partisan alignment is significant because it suggests the issue touched something broader than ordinary political disagreement. When leaders from different parts of the political spectrum respond in similar ways, it often signals that a widely held value is felt to be at stake. It is also worth reflecting on the role of climate as an underlying theme, without overstating what can be concluded. The disagreement between the two governments is not only about a single fire season. It reflects a deeper divide over how to interpret the causes of severe wildfires and how to respond to them. Canadian leaders have framed the fires within the context of climate change and global cooperation. Some American officials have framed them primarily as a matter of forest management. That difference in framing is not a small detail. It shapes the policies each side favors and the language each side uses when a crisis like this unfolds. Let me return to the human element, because it anchors everything else. Thousands of people have been affected by this wildfire season, with communities forced to leave their homes and firefighters working under demanding and dangerous conditions. The loss of the British Columbia pilot who died while assisting in Colorado is a sobering reminder of the risks involved. These are the realities beneath the political exchange, and they are the reason the debate carried such emotional weight. When a disaster involves real danger and real sacrifice, the way leaders talk about it is not a minor matter to the people living through it. So where does this leave the story right now? Several things are clear, and several remain unresolved. What has clearly changed is the tone of the conversation. A natural disaster that might have prompted offers of mutual aid instead became the subject of blame and a proposed link to trade policy. What remains unresolved is whether that proposal will ever take concrete form. The suggested tariff connection has not been implemented, no formal process has been announced, and the promised conversation between the two leaders had not, based on the available information, produced any binding outcome. There are a few developments worth watching closely in the days ahead. The first is whether the President and Prime Minister Carney actually hold the discussion that was mentioned, and what emerges from it if they do. The second is whether the idea of attaching wildfire costs to tariffs advances beyond a statement into any kind of formal proposal. The third is how the wildfire season itself evolves, since worsening conditions could keep the issue prominent, while improving air quality might reduce the pressure. Each of these factors could shift the direction of the story, and none of them is settled yet. It is also worth keeping an eye on how provincial and state governments respond going forward. Premier Ford's emphasis on the history of Canadian assistance to the United States may continue to shape how this debate is framed in Canada.
Later in the afternoon, Carney made his way to the Canadian Embassy,
Good afternoon.
just down Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House, and told reporters he asked Trump to stop.
On the American side, officials in states affected by the smoke may continue to press the forest management argument. How these regional voices interact with the national leaders will influence whether this remains a heated exchange of words or develops into something with more lasting policy consequences. For now, the situation is best described as fluid. Before I close, I want to underline the distinction that is run through this entire report, because it is the point that gives the story its significance. This was not fundamentally a dispute about tariffs on manufactured goods. It was about how two closely connected countries respond when a natural disaster crosses the line between them. Smoke does not stop at a customs checkpoint, and fire does not follow political boundaries. That simple reality is why so many people felt the exchange revealed something meaningful about the state of the relationship, and why the contrast between blame and cooperation resonated so widely. The strongest test of any partnership tends to come during moments of difficulty rather than during periods of calm. This week offered exactly such a moment, and it produced two very different visions of how neighbors should treat one another in a crisis. One approach centered on assigning fault and applying pressure. The other centered on shared responsibility and the value of working together. Which of those approaches ultimately prevails in the relationship between Canada and the United States is not yet decided, and it may depend on choices that have not yet been made. That is what makes this story one to keep following. To summarize where things stand, the American president has blamed Canada for wildfire smoke and floated adding related costs to existing tariffs. Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Prime Minister Mark Carney have pushed back by stressing cooperation and the long history of mutual aid. And the practical question of whether any new trade measure will actually materialize remains open. The health effects of the smoke are real and ongoing on both sides of the border. The underlying disagreement over the causes of severe wildfires continues, and the next official steps will determine whether this becomes a lasting policy fight or fades as conditions change. Thank you for watching my report on the dispute between Donald Trump and Canadian leaders over wildfire smoke, tariffs, and the response from Prime Minister Mark Carney and Premier Doug Ford. This remains a developing situation, and the next conversation between the two governments could offer a clearer sense of what comes next. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can follow the latest verified updates as this story continues to unfold and as the wildfire season progresses on both sides of the border.